All right, so just by way of some quick introductions, thank you all for coming out. My name is Nick DiBenedetto. I'm the Vice President of the Federalist Society here. And just going to run through quick introductions for our speakers real quick, and then we'll let them get started. So we're pleased to welcome back Professor Josh Blackman. Professor Blackman is an Associate Professor of Law at the South Texas College of Law in Houston. He specializes in constitutional law, the United States Supreme Court, and the intersection of law and technology. Many of you will probably remember him from our 3D printed guns event last year, which was very popular. Professor Blackman is the author of the critically acclaimed Unprecedented, The Constitutional Challenge to Obamacare, and Unraveled, Obamacare, Religious Liberty, and Executive Power. And he has also recently just come out with a new book with Professor Randy Barnett of Georgetown, 100 Constitutional Law Cases Everyone Needs to Know, which I highly recommend to you all. Professor Blackman was selected by Forbes magazine for the 30 Under 30 in Law and Policy. Professor Blackman has twice testified before the House Judiciary Committee on the constitutionality of executive action on immigration and healthcare. He is an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. He is the founder and president of the Harlan Institute, the founder of Fantasy SCOTUS, the internet's premier Supreme Court fantasy league, and blogs regularly at joshblackman.com. If it is going on and it's interesting in the world of law, Professor Blackman has you covered. He's also the author of over 4 dozen law review articles, and his commentary has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, USA Today, LA Times, and other national publications. Joining us today as well is our own Professor Perry Dane. Professor Dane received his BA summa cum laude from Yale College and his JD from Yale Law School, where he was the note editor of the Law Journal and received the Israel H. Here Perez Prize Award by the faculty for the best student contribution to the Yale Law Journal. After law school, he clerked for Judge David Bazelon of the United States Court of Appeals and Justice William Brennan of the United States Supreme Court, and then served for 9 years on the Yale Law School faculty. Professor Dane has written landmark articles on choice of law, religion and law, the jurisprudence of Jewish law, legal pluralism, and jurisdiction. He teaches conflict of law, constitutional law, American Indian law, jurisdiction, law and religion, nonprofit organizations, education law, the Canadian legal system, and the debate on same-sex marriage, and seminars on legalism and religion and the state in cross-national perspective. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speakers.
Thank you so much to Nick and to the Federal Society for hosting me, Professor Dane for taking time out of his busy sabbatical. He's on sabbatical now, but he's coming here to talk to us today about an important issue, which is the Second Amendment. Last year I was here to talk about a case I am personally involved in, which involved 3D printed guns. This topic is a little bit more urgent for the court, and it involves the Second Amendment outside the home. My goal today is to walk you through the history of the Second Amendment at the Supreme Court, discuss the current case from New York that will be argued in a few weeks, and raise another case from here in New Jersey that very well may make it to the Supreme Court this current term. Okay? So let's start. The Supreme Court did not do much work on the Second Amendment until the year 2008, right? There were a couple decisions throughout the centuries that sort of alluded to it. But the first major opinion came with District of Columbia versus Heller. And it presented two choices. Okay? Does the Second Amendment protect an individual right to keep and bear arms? Or does the Second Amendment secure a right to bear arms in the service of a state militia? The court split 5-4 on this question. The majority opinion was written by Justice Scalia. He was joined by Chief Justice Roberts, Justice Kennedy, Justice Thomas, and Justice Alito. And they argue that on the whole, the better reading of the Second Amendment was an individual right, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, that was not conditioned on militia service. The dissenting opinion was by Justice Stevens, who was joined by Justices Souter, Ginsburg, and Breyer, and they took the opposite position. They argued that the Second Amendment is best understood to be a right to own a gun in service of militia. And just to be precise, It wasn't the right of the states to have militias, a sort of a weird right they described. It was the right of individuals to have guns which they could use in a state militia. That is, you kept a gun at home, and then when the militia called you up, you could use your own gun in service of the state militia. But they could still prohibit you from using that gun, say, for hunting or self-defense. All right, that was a 5-4 decision, which I'm not here to revisit. It's a 10-year-old case at which I think we can have an entire debate on. But I want to focus on a different aspect. Okay? What happened after Heller? Almost immediately after Heller was decided, there was follow-up litigation. Heller involved a law in the District of Columbia, a federal law, right? Could the federal government ban the possession of handguns in the home? That's all Heller decided. The follow-up case, though, wasn't a federal law, it was a state law. In 2010, the court decided McDonald v. City of Chicago. The City of Chicago also banned the possession of handguns in the home. The question in McDonald was whether the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, was incorporated or extended to the states. And again, the court had a couple choices. The first option was that they could incorporate the Second Amendment through what's known as substantive due process. The 14th Amendment protects certain liberties, and they say you can't take away liberty without the due process of law. Was the right to bear arms one of the liberties protected by the 14th Amendment? The other option was a provision of the Constitution that is not well known. It's called the Privileges or Immunities Clause. It's a provision of the 14th Amendment. This is a provision that has not gotten much attention, but there was a strong argument that I find compelling that when the right to bear arms was discussed in the 1860s, it was considered a fundamental right, one of these privileges of citizenship. And this right then would protect it against state abridgment. The vote in McDonald overall was 5-4. 5 justices found the Chicago handgun law unconstitutional, and 4 found that the law could stand. Okay? The plurality opinion was by Justice Alito, and he found that the right to bear arms should be incorporated through substantive due process. Even Justice Scalia, who hated substantive due process, went along with it. Justice Thomas took the other approach. Justice Thomas relied on the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment and said that there's a deeply rooted historical right to bear arms and the states cannot violate it. Okay, so far, not much is said. All Heller and McDonald actually held was that the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep a handgun in the home. They didn't decide other issues. For example, they didn't decide carrying a gun outside the home. They did not decide what kinds of guns you can keep. They did not decide what kind of storage laws are permissible. They did not decide what sort of background check processes are permissible. They did not decide whether you need to show a special need. All of these questions, which people actually care about, were sort of just left undecided. Right? Now, why? Well, we can speculate. Perhaps one reason is that there weren't the votes to reach further than handguns in the home. We know Justice Kennedy was always sort of on the fence about these things, and maybe even Chief Justice Roberts was unwilling to reach that far. But the court had to sort of just let these issues aside. At that point, after 2010, the lower courts began to issue decisions which tried to consider specific Second Amendment challenges. One of the first questions to consider is what tier of scrutiny, right? How should you review laws that burden the Second Amendment? In Heller, the majority in the dissent disagreed. Justice Breyer, in the dissent, would have applied what you might call a rational basis style review or interest balancing, where you sort of take on one hand the pros and the other hand you take the cons, you sort of balance it out and you see, is this gun law worth it? Does it achieve enough benefits? Without question, the majority rejected that sort of interest balancing approach. So we know rational basis scrutiny is out, but we don't know what kind of heightened review is in. The lower courts more or less settled on what is known as intermediate scrutiny, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's somewhere between strict scrutiny and rational basis. The defining characteristic of intermediate scrutiny is that the government needs to provide some justification for the law, but it doesn't have to be a compelling justification. It has to be just a pretty good one. And the law doesn't have to be a perfect fit, but it has to be a decent fit. You know, for example, if one state decides we want to limit the number of bullets in a magazine to 10 bullets, right? Well, why 10? Why not 12? Why not 14? Under a strict scrutiny standard, you would need to show specifically why did you choose 10? Why is that the number you selected, right? Is there some data, some science shows 10 is the right number? But under intermediate scrutiny, the government has a little bit more leeway, a little bit more discretion. And indeed, in these cases, yeah, 10 bullets, that's fine. Doesn't have to be perfect, but it's good enough. The upshot of this sort of intermediate scrutiny is that almost every single gun law has been upheld. I didn't say every, but almost every. There have been a few exceptions here and there, but for the most part, the lower courts have upheld most gun control laws. There's one exception that's worth noting. It's actually the Third Circuit, which involves felon disenfranchisement, right? Let's say that you committed a non-violent felony early in your life and you lost your gun rights. Does a Second Amendment protect the right to have your gun rights restored? The classic example is Martha Stewart, right? Can Martha Stewart own a gun, right? You committed a white-collar offense, so it's non-violent. You've shown no propensity to harm anyone, maybe financially harm people, but no physical harm at least, right? So there have been some cases where the courts have divided and said that certain non-violent felons may have a Second Amendment right to have their gun rights restored. Or perhaps people who are diagnosed with some sort of a mental condition that has now been cured, right, should be forever barred from owning a gun. But those are the outliers, which maybe even people on the left and right could perhaps agree on those much. But the actual cases that actually are weighty have simply been ignored, right? All those challenges have been turned away. Let me walk through a couple of them with you. One law is from San Francisco. San Francisco had a law that said a handgun must be locked at all times at the home unless it's carried on the person. So in other words, if you're home, you can keep a gun on your holster on your hip, but if you put it down for 1 second, it has to be a locked container. But that was a San Francisco law. Good luck opening the trigger lock if you have a nighttime break-in. It's actually very difficult. If you ever try unlocking your iPhone when you're half asleep? Yeah, try turning a combination lock, okay? But the Ninth Circuit upheld this law. It found it was a reasonable safety measure. Critically, this law applies even if there are no children present. Even if you live alone by yourself, you still have to keep the gun locked up. The case was appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court denied review. They denied certiorari. Justice Thomas and Justice Scalia dissented from the denial of certiorari. These are pretty rare. Usually when a case is denied cert, nothing happens. They just deny review. But this was the first time that justices had weighed in on the Second Amendment, saying, hey, we have this case McDonald. What are we going to do about it? Justice Thomas was flummoxed by how the Ninth Circuit ignored the Supreme Court's ruling. He wrote, quote, despite the clarity with which we describe the Second Amendment protection here, lower courts have failed to protect it. He added, Second Amendment rights are no less protected by our Constitution than other rights enumerated in that document. He then said, we have other rights, the First, Fourth, and Eighth Amendments, which are routinely reviewed and enforced by the courts. But Second Amendment challenges are treated differently. There was another case, this one from Highland Park, Illinois. Highland Park, Illinois banned all magazines. I'm from Staten Island. I didn't know what guns were when I was younger. A magazine is not a thing you read, right? A magazine is a little box with bullets in, right? That's what a magazine is. I didn't touch a gun until I was 21 years old when I moved to law school in Virginia, so I will take sympathy for my friends from the Garden State. Highland Park banned all magazines with more than 10 bullets and so-called assault weapons. The phrase assault weapons doesn't mean anything. It doesn't describe how dangerous a weapon is. It refers to cosmetic features. Okay. Millions of Americans own these types of weapons for self-defense, hunting, and target shooting. The Seventh Circuit upheld both of these laws, and they said Heller only limits bans on handguns, but no other bans are implicated by the Second Amendment. This case was appealed to the Supreme Court, and once again the Supreme Court denied review, sensing a pattern. Once again, Justice Thomas dissented, joined by Justice Scalia. And he charged the Seventh Circuit with having a crabbed reading of Heller that ignores a fundamental premise. And the Court of Appeals said that even if the law didn't improve public safety, it still survives. I say it again. Even if this law did nothing to improve public safety, it will survive. Why? Because the law may increase the public sense of safety, as people might feel more safe with this law in effect. If that is enough to uphold a law, then every law will be upheld. Right? The fact that they might feel safer is enough. Then Justice Thomas criticized his colleagues. That includes Roberts, Kennedy, and Alito. He said that the majority joined Heller and McDonald, but they've been MIA. They've been absent since. In other contexts, the court routinely grants reviews on these cases. He then said that we should not be treating the Second Amendment as a second-class right. Well, that was in 2015. A couple months later, Justice Scalia suddenly passed away. And the court would go a couple more years without having any voice on the Second Amendment until this year. This year, the court has a case before it from New York. New York has a law that's very strange, and I'm going to try to describe it to you as clearly as I can. Let's say you have two houses, right? Let's say you have one house in Staten Island, where I live, and let's say you have another house in New Jersey. New York law makes it a crime to transport your gun from your house in Staten Island to your house in New Jersey, even if the gun is locked up and disassembled in a case. Let's say you want to go to a shooting competition in Connecticut. You cannot bring your gun out of the state. Let's say that you want to bring your gun to get repaired or serviced. You can't bring your gun out of the state unless you have one of these premise licenses, which are almost impossible to get. Now, this law is completely irrational, right? As long as the gun is locked up in a case, I can't think of a good reason why you can't bring it from one house to another, right? Or you can't bring it to a shooting competition, you can't bring it to repairmen, right? This is not about people who can pull over the side of the road, take their gun out, assemble it, and in an act of road rage shoot someone, right? There's just no evidence this will ever actually happen. The law made no sense. Yet New York vigorously defended it in the lower court. They defended it in the district court, they defended it in the Second Circuit, and both of those courts upheld the law as a reasonable gun control regulation until the Supreme Court granted certiorari. When the court granted certiorari, New York said, uh-oh, we're going to lose this one. And we're going to set a precedent that's very bad. So let's keep this away from the court. So what did New York do? They repealed the law. They not only repealed the law, they basically made it impossible to reenact this law. Right? They said, look, we're not going to enforce this. We will never enforce this. Please, Supreme Court, dismiss this case as moot. They're probably right. Unfortunately, when Nick asked me to do this event, the facts were a little bit different. But I think at this juncture, the most likely outcome is the court dismisses this case as moot. That is, there's no more live controversy to resolve because the law has been repealed. Now again, New York was happy to defend this law at every single level until they get to the Supreme Court where they realize there's a chance that they might lose. Then they kill the law. There is one exception to the mootness doctrine, which I'll mention, which may come to play. It's what's called voluntary cessation. Right? What does that mean? If the government promises to voluntarily cease some sort of illegal practice as a way to avoid litigation, the courts say, no, this is not going to work. So imagine you have a police department that routinely brutalizes people, and there's a lawsuit pending, and they're about to go to trial. And the chief of the police says, Your Honor, we're going to stop brutalizing people. Just dismiss the case. We promise we'll stop. We promise. Okay. No one's going to believe them, right? Like, that's not going to happen. So the court says, look, even though you say you're going to stop, we don't really believe you, and we're going to keep this case going to trial. I don't think, to be perfectly objective, that the New York case fits in that voluntary cessation doctrine. They've repealed this law. Maybe they can try to reenact it, but they've even taken steps making it that this sort of regime cannot be reenacted. So I don't know if this issue has any legitimacy left. So we'll have an argument, I think, is it this month, Nick? December 2nd. Yeah, December 2nd. Thank you, sir. So we'll have an argument next month. I think most of the argument will be taken up discussing this mootness issue, and I think eventually the court will dismiss it, what's called a dig. Dismiss as improvidently granted. They'll dig the case, and it goes away. But we're not done. Right? There are other cases involving you, New Jersey. There's a case by the name of, let me try to get to, I think it's Rogers, right? Rogers versus Graywall, your beloved Attorney General, who I've run into a couple times legally. This is a case about the right to bear arms outside the home. In New Jersey, if you want a permit to carry a gun outside the home, you need to show something specific. You need to show that you have what's called a justifiable need, right? It's not enough to be, a good citizen without a criminal background. You have to show a justifiable need. What does that mean? It's not enough to say that you're afraid or you want self-defense, protection. You have to show something very specific. What that is, not exactly clear. And whenever the government has sort of discretionary standard, there are always going to be favorites. But if you're a celebrity, if you're a musician, if you're an athlete, you're a powerful, popular person, you're going to get your permit, right? You're going to get your permit. But if you're a regular Joe Schmo like me, you're getting nothing. When you have these sort of discretionary standards, there's a lot of favoritism that goes on. The plaintiffs in this case, it's a guy named Rogers, and the didn't even know it existed, the New Jersey Rifle and Pistol Club. It's a thing. The New Jersey Rifle and Pistol Club, they've challenged this as a violation of the Second Amendment. And I think if the court dumps the New York case, they'll just pick up the one across the Hudson. They'll take the New Jersey case and grant it for the current term. And if they do that, at that point, you're actually going to have a real case about whether the Second Amendment applies outside the home. The New York case is kind of funky. It's, do you have a right to keep a gun locked in your trunk in a case? My God, I mean, let's assume the answer is yes. Who cares, right? So what? What are you going to do with that? Keep a gun locked in your trunk? That's not going to help anyone. It's sort of like such a trivial ruling. But the New Jersey one actually has some teeth because it's whether you have the right to have a license to carry a handgun. You still have to go through the training. You'll still have to go through background checks. But assuming you have no red flags, can the government still deny you a license based on some sort of discretionary standard that's pretty uninformed? And I think, and maybe this is a bad prediction, that there are probably 5 votes now that Justice Kennedy's got for the position that you have the right to bear arms outside the home, and the states have to give you a license when you pass the test. Almost half the states, was it about 40 states in the union, I think, 30-something states, have what's called a shall issue regime. Texas, for example, has shall issue. That is, if I apply for a handgun permit, they will give me a license as long as I meet the requirements. New Jersey has what's called may issue, where they'll give it to you if they like you enough. They think you're deserving enough for the permit. I suspect that the court may very well hold that a may issue regime is unconstitutional. You still have to pass background checks, but people in New Jersey who have all the requisite character and fitness requirements may be allowed now to carry firearms outside the home. There's still places you can't carry them, the government buildings and the courts and the schools and other places, but there are some places where you'll be able to. Private businesses can generally exclude them altogether. But I'm not sure. It's also possible that the court will look at this New York case, say, never mind, we'll come back to this next year. We don't want to get into this fuss now. We don't want to get into this mix of guns. We have impeachment, right? We have all this other stuff going on. John Roberts like, man, look at so busy this year. Let's do something else. Let's come back to this in a couple of years, right? Maybe. Break my heart again. But I think there's a decent chance if they get rid of the New York case, they pluck up the New Jersey case, and this may give the court an opportunity to discuss if, in fact, the Second Amendment applies outside the home. All right. Thank you so much. Professor Dane will have some words, and then we'll take some questions later. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
So thanks. Should I put this on or?
Hey, put in your tie.
No, I mean, is it to record or?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, there we go. How's that?
Beautiful.
So this is for your little, what is that thing?
It's a wireless camera.
It looks like one of the, yeah. Anyway, so thank you, Nick, for inviting me, and thank you, Professor Blackman, for coming all the way from Staten Island by way of Texas.
Long trip.
Long trip. So first, to get a couple of things out of the way, I think Professor Blackman is right that most people agree that the particular New York statute at issue, or ordinance, or was especially extreme, unreasonable, arbitrary, would probably be held unconstitutional under most standards, and New York was right to repeal it, quite apart from any opportunistic reason they might have had to have it declared moot. But that doesn't really go to the broader question of Second Amendment rights outside the home. It simply goes to the weirdness of this particular statute, and for that matter, though I haven't looked at the New Jersey statute in detail, if it really is a statute that simply gives more or less unfettered discretion to law enforcement officials to decide whether to give somebody a license, that could be held unconstitutional quite apart from the Second Amendment. We're about to have some new skylights put in our house, and if our local ordinance said that the construction license would be given at the discretion of the local building authority, I suspect that would be unconstitutional too, not because we have a substantive right to put skylights in our roof, but because whenever the government conditions licenses on that sort of discretionary decision, there's going to be at least some suspicion. So we're probably still waiting for the case that more squarely poses the question, quite apart from just totally arbitrary laws, quite apart from arbitrary procedures. Is there a Second Amendment right outside the home as a substantive matter? And I don't have a particularly settled view on that, I have to admit. I'm not a great fan of the Second Amendment, I have to say, but once we have Heller in place, we have to, in good faith, follow its injunction. And once you do that, it seems to me that the question of rights outside the home is a difficult one. I mean, my own instinct is that it would be wrong just to categorically limit Second Amendment rights outside the home. But there might be something of a sliding scale, sort of akin to rights of privacy, sort of akin to Fourth Amendment rights. Taking into account the specific statute at issue, there are probably stronger arguments for rights in the home than outside the home. Regulation outside the home should probably be upheld on a somewhat looser standard. Rights outside the home seem to me to be more attenuated. But it doesn't strike me, at least instinctively, as an either-or matter or as a totally categorical matter. Part of the problem with the arguments, I have to say, is that there's a certain tension that's been built into the Second Amendment all along and which Heller exposed. So if we focus on the militia piece of it, as some commentators have, then it does seem silly to say that you only have rights in the home, because after all, where do militias don't simply operate in one's home. On the other hand, if we really do focus on the militia piece of it, then the collective rights interpretation that Heller rejected suddenly seems more plausible. So if we're to treat gun ownership and gun use as an individual right, we need to somehow imagine a role for a single member of this amorphous, non-specific militia, disconnected from a more general command structure, which might be what the Second Amendment, if you believe Heller, is getting at. And then it seems to me that the question of whether that right is more properly focused in the home or elsewhere. I should also say that I think whether or not you agree with the Second Circuit decision in the New York case, it does seem to me that the overall approach has something to be said for it. The idea that there are core Second Amendment rights that we treat differently from more peripheral rights. That there's not one standard of scrutiny, but various standards of scrutiny, depending on what's at stake. And again, I'm not suggesting that they applied that idea correctly in the New York case, but it seems to me that something like that general approach makes sense. It's also an interesting question how we go about deciding whether there's a right outside the home. I mean, how do we get started in thinking about a problem like that? Do we just do what I've sort of done, which is try to come up with some rational construct of what the Second Amendment seems to be doing, at least if you take Heller seriously? Or do we do what some commentators have done, which is to look to tradition, history, original meaning? As those of you who are in my con law class know, I'm a bit of a skeptic about original public meaning as a method of constitutional interpretation. But that doesn't mean that history is irrelevant. History can be relevant in all sorts of ways, even if you reject it as the sort of single measure by which you think about constitutional questions. But it does still sort of gnaw at me to wonder, how do you get off the ground in thinking about this sort of problem and other sorts of problems, but just specifically, how do you get off the ground? And I'd really sort of welcome Professor Blackman's ideas about that. Not so much the view of the bottom line, which, as I say, I'm sort of a take it or leave it person on that. But quite apart from the bottom line, how do you sort of begin the process of thinking about the problem? So let me just say a couple of other things. And this goes to the context in which we might want to think about the problem. So I want to look at two sorts of questions. One is the nature of constitutional rights, or the nature of different constitutional rights. And then I want to, at the end, try to situate this a little bit in the elephant in the room, which is the culture wars, right? This is not just about the Second Amendment, right? These debates are not just about the Second Amendment. I suspect that for Professor Blackman, they really are, right? I think for him and for serious people like him, Second Amendment has there's something at stake in the Second Amendment and in thinking about the Second Amendment quite on its own. But I think he's the exception. He's the exception. And I think that for lots of folks on both sides, right? For lots of folks on both sides, there's something else going on. So I want to talk a little bit about that at the end. So as to the nature of constitutional rights, I'll just start with a simple point. Constitutional rights are not absolute. Many constitutional rights are subject to all sorts of routine, even pervasive regulation. One of my favorite examples is marriage, which is something that I've written and thought about. Marriage has been declared to be a constitutional right, not just a comparative right, but a basic substantive right, and yet it's subject to all sorts of limitations, procedural limitations, substantive limitations. You have to get a license, right? All sorts of things. There are limitations on who you can marry and under what circumstances and how long you have to wait. And Obergefell, the famous same-sex marriage case, doesn't really change that basic description of the right to marry. What it says is that there's this sort of one particular imperative, which is an entire class of people, gay folks, should not be deprived of the possibility of marriage in some categorical way. But that leaves in place the fact that that marriage as an institution and as a constitutional right is subject to all sorts of limitations and all sorts of restrictions. Or think about abortion, right? Think about abortion and the leeway that the court has given to regulate it. And even those of us who support abortion rights would agree that there has to be some leeway for restrictions, some leeway for regulation. Or think of all the various criminal procedural rights, right? None of which is absolute. So, in many cases, the limitations are built into the language of the right, and the Fourth Amendment, for example, is an example of that. In other cases, they arise out of the way we understand the right and how we think about countervailing considerations. So take the right against self-incrimination. For a long time, the assumption in our legal tradition was that one of the implications of the right against self-incrimination was that criminal defendants could not testify on their own behalf. Not only that they could not be forced to do so, but that they wouldn't be allowed to do so. And it took a long time, well after the drafting of, or the enactment of the right against self-incrimination in the Bill of Rights, it took a long time for that to turn, and one reason it turned was because of the countervailing consideration that in fact defendants might well see it to their benefit to testify. And in the case of the Second Amendment, the countervailing considerations are pretty obvious. And we see them every time there's a mass shooting, and we see them every time there's a statistic published about not just the rate of gun crimes, but the rate of gun suicides, gun accidents. And it seems to me at least potentially relevant to how we think about the constitutional question. There's also a bit of history here. The regulation of guns, even in the face of a right to bear arms, goes back to the beginning. And it was very often exercised locally through justices of the peace, not so much through statutes, but through various traditional constraints that were put on people's liberty. So what about the analogy to the First Amendment, right? You see a lot of rhetoric saying, well, we treat the First Amendment seriously, why can't we treat the Second Amendment just as seriously? The First Amendment is pretty absolute. The Second Amendment should at least be given that same dignity. It seems to me there are just a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that the First Amendment isn't absolute either. There are all sorts of forms of speech that are subject to looser standards. We also allow, in the context of the First Amendment, a good many of what are called time, place, and manner restrictions, which are not entirely analogous to some of the restrictions on guns, but are at least sort of roughly in the same universe. Nevertheless, it's true. Right, it's true. The First Amendment has been taken with exquisite seriousness by the court. It's not absolute. There are both exceptions and subtleties, but it's pretty damn near absolute in at least a fair number of contexts. But it seems to me that's a deceptive analogy. And it's a deceptive analogy for a few reasons. One is that with respect to the First Amendment, we're concerned not just about people's right to speak in some abstract sense. We're specifically concerned about giving the government the right to draw lines regarding speech. So that in itself is one of the things we're protecting against. So Professor Blackman, I think quite rightly said, if you have a totally discretionary license law, you can imagine the government saying, well, we're going to favor, I don't know, celebrities over non-celebrities. And that's a problem. That's a real problem. and that's an equal protection problem. It's not a gun problem. Right? On the other hand, with respect to freedom of speech, preferring some forms of speech to others isn't just an equality problem, it's a speech problem. Right? So drawing lines is a problem within the logic of the First Amendment. And it seems to me that distinguishes the First Amendment from other rights in a very important way. That's one reason that the court has all of these doctrines about vagueness and overbreadth and breathing room and avoiding a chilling effect, right? It's precisely because what's at stake is not just people's right to speak, what's at stake is also giving the government too large a role in defining people's right to speak. And just one other thing about the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, which is going to segue to the last point that I want to make quickly. It seems to me that, roughly speaking, constitutional rights fall into two classes, very, very roughly speaking. There's some rights that we respect because we think they're important as a component of individual liberty. The other rights were, in addition to thinking they're a component of individual liberty, we actually want to nurture that activity. Right? There's a principled commitment to nurturing that activity, not just to respecting it. Seems to me that's true for speech. It's not just that we allow individuals to speak as they like. We actually think that robust speech is a good thing. Seems to me, more controversially perhaps, that's what the religion clauses are getting at. They're not just about individual liberty, they're about nurturing religion. Lots of constitutional rights aren't like that. I mean, the court has said specifically with respect to abortion, for example, even when the court was very protective of abortion rights, more than it is now, the court has said we enforce the individual's right, a woman's right over her own body. Doesn't mean that the state has to think that abortion is a good thing. And in fact, the state can do lots of things to reflect its view in law that abortion is not a good thing. And it seems to me that, at least my view is that guns fall into that second class. But here's where we get to the culture wars, because I can imagine lots of people taking the first view, that guns, just like speech, just like religion, that the use of guns is something that we as a society, as reflected in our Constitution, don't simply respect, but actually want to nurture, encourage. That, and it seems to me that there's a real divide about that, because my instinct is that that can't be right. But I completely understand that there are lots of people for whom the instinct is just the opposite. So that's where the culture war piece comes in, because the Second Amendment debate is a proxy for a whole set of other debates in our increasingly polarized society. It's interesting, you occasionally hear some people talk about our Second Amendment, right? Not the Second Amendment, but our Second Amendment. There's this sort of proprietary feeling about it. And then the other side talks about the damn Second Amendment, right? There's something deeper going on than simply guns, right? Guns are attached to a broader set of divides. And you see this in other contexts, right? In the field that I'm more familiar with, you see this in the debate between LGBTQ rights and religious rights. The individual cases are often much lower stakes than we imagine. But each side thinks that the other one is trying to destroy it, and that it's using these relatively specific laws or specific claims to simply devour the other side. And I think there's something similar going on in the gun context. So I think however we decide this question, that culture war is going to remain. So what do we do about it? Well, one thing to do, and this idea is by no means original with me. There's a great article by Joseph Blocker from Duke, who suggests that maybe we should localize our conception of Second Amendment rights. Just like to some extent, we long ago localized our conception of at least one tiny corner of the First Amendment, which, with respect to obscenity. When I clerked for Justice Brennan, he explained that the reason that they adopted the so-called community standards test, which essentially drove everything back to local juries, the reason they adopted it was that the justices were sick and tired of having to go into the Supreme Court basement several times a term to watch dirty movies and decide for themselves whether something was protected. So they localized it. And I'm not quite sure how that would work in the Second Amendment context. I don't think everything can be localized, but I think some things can. And I wonder if that's at least one way, not of avoiding, but at least working around what I think are some of the deeper conflicts that these debates reflect. Thank you.
Thank you. There was so much there, and we have a few minutes left. How about someone asks a question, and I may try and use the question as a way to springboard something Professor Dane gave, because there's so many things I want to respond to. Yes, in the front. Yes.
Could you say more on that?
Sure. This is a very common misconception. Okay, so the phrase AR-15. How many people think AR stands for automatic rifle? It does not, right? It's a brand. It stands for Armalite, okay? Almost all rifles have a single feature. You pull the trigger once and one bullet comes out, right? If you pull the trigger once and many bullets comes out, it's called an automatic weapon. Those are not quite illegal, but almost impossible to obtain. Almost all rifles you buy in any store, maybe not New Jersey, but in almost any store, you pull the trigger once, one bullet comes out. The phrase assault weapon describes certain cosmetic features. It does not describe the strength of the bullet coming out. So for example, if at the end of a gun you have a little grip, it's called a pistol grip, right? You hold it like this. If it has that feature, the pistol grip, that may make it an assault weapon. If you have what's called a shoulder stock, which is a little thing that pops out and you kind of lean the gun against your shoulder to get a better angle, right? That's merely a matter of convenience. That's a feature that makes an assault weapon. If, for example, you have what's called a detachable magazine, where you can push a button, the magazine pops out, and you can load new bullets, right? In most states, like New Jersey, if you have 2 or 3 of those features, maybe a pistol grip and a shoulder attachment, or a pistol grip and detachable magazine, those features make it an assault weapon. Let me tell you, you can easily modify, Graywall, don't listen to me, you can easily modify any rifle and get around these assault weapons bans. They're meaningless. They're utterly meaningless. They do not actually stop you from having these weapons. I'll give you an example. California banned a detachable magazine. How they define detachable magazine? You push a button and the magazine pops out. Okay, so instead of having a button, you have to turn a screw, right? These standards are basically meaningless. So the phrase assault weapon was designed to scare people. That's the primary goal, and it does it very well. But I appreciate it. I love educating people. I grew up in Staten Island. There were no guns where we grew up because it wasn't a thing that anyone even had. I'm sure New Jersey is very similar. I was not answering any of your questions, but I'll do my best. Another question, maybe. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I was curious, the point you made earlier about the Second Amendment just talking about in terms of militia versus deterrent direct consent. I'm curious to hear how the living constitutionalist versus the textualist approach that argument. It seems like from the living constitutionalist perspective, that would be a little broader since we don't usually have groups of people coming out of their homes with rifles fighting off marauders versus the textualist. I feel like we tend to view it that way. So how do the two sides agree?
Well, a couple things. So one, Heller was somewhat unique. You had a dissent by Justice Stevens but it was not a living constitutionalist dissent in no regard. Justice Stevens actually wrote what I would call an originalist opinion. I think Professor Dane might agree with me on that one. He spent a lot of effort and a lot of time combing through the history of the Second Amendment, its drafting history, various provisions in state constitutions. So I don't even think that this is a living constitutionalist issue. You know, if you were a living constitutionalist and you look at most countries around the world, this is an easy question. There's almost no right to private gun ownership in the free world. So the United States is kind of unique. But going to the militia question, that is the core debate, right? What is the relationship between the prefatory clause, about having a well-regulated militia, and what's called the operative clause, the right of people to bear arms? This is something that Scalia and Stevens dissent over and fight, and I don't have even nearly enough time to get through it, but I encourage you to read the Heller opinion, and that will give you a good sense of where they are on the issue. But thank you. I like marauders, so that's kind of cool. I love that. That's a good word. Other questions? I know you have a thing in 4 minutes with wine. I don't want to compete with the wine. Yes, in the back.
If the Supreme Court recognizes the right to carry outside of home, do you have any thoughts on what that might mean for future implementation of common use tests under Heller that we already have? So for
Yeah.
instance, it would be very common in states that allow for concealed carry already that a law-abiding citizen carries as with him or her at all times 15-round magazines. Are there any considerations about whether or not those become more common?
Well, look, if you want to apply a common use test, and we use word common, most ARs, most semi-automatic rifles are fairly commonly held outside of New York, New Jersey, and California. These are very commonly held weapons. In Texas, where I live, you can open carry an AR-15 on your back with a magazine locked in, and people manage to live. In Texas, on public school campuses, you can conceal carry in classrooms, and people do just fine. I think a lot of it is just like, oh my God, how's that possible? It's been in existence for states for some time, and people who have concealed carry licenses don't commit crimes. The rate of offense is like almost zero. These are pretty law-abiding people. So I think if you actually had a shall issue jurisdiction in New Jersey, you would find the people who actually apply for these licenses are not going to be the marauders who you have to take out. Maybe, I don't know. What do I know? Yeah, yes, sir, over there.
Yeah, how did that gun club, what's their angle, like, how did they get into the
Well, generally, in common law, there's something called associational standing, where if you have a group of people who have some sort of shared common interest, right, you can litigate on behalf of them. So maybe like the Sierra Club might be a good example, right? An environmental group where all of your members are like-minded environmentalists, and you can challenge some sort of, law affecting the environment, endangered species, or habitat, or whatever. But there's also an individual New Jersey guy, his name is Rogers, can't remember his first name, and he challenged the fact that he cannot get his license. I think Professor Day made a fair point. A lot of these standards may be on constitutional and due process grounds, as they're completely arbitrary, discretionless. I mean, there's pure discretion. There's no actual standard, and I'm okay with those arguments. If a court wants to hold that a city must give some guidance over who gets a permit, who doesn't, put the legislator in there, right? Define what are the characteristics you're looking for. But if all the statute says is there a justifiable need? That's a very pliable standard that doesn't have anything that I can define, and I don't know what that. Maybe it's a void for vagueness. Maybe the court can duck that way. Then they say, if we don't even care, we'll just assume there's liberty involved with the due process clause. Forget scrutiny. This is void for vagueness. And there have been cases in the Ninth Circuit where the courts have rejected void for vagueness challenges. So that is perhaps an out, but the criminal laws don't always go your way with vagueness challenges. Maybe one more question. I know we have to get after soon. Yes, in the back.
So, as much as I like owning guns, I sort of do enjoy the idea of localizing it. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. And
Yeah.
also, do you feel that way about the rest of the Constitution? Should we just the second?
Sure. I actually wrote a response before Joseph Blocher's article saying that obscenity is the exception, not the rule. Generally, the right to be free from searches and seizures means the same thing in Newark, New Jersey as it does in Provo, Utah, right? We don't vary constitutional standards. Obscenity is an exception. I suggest the obscenity doctrine is basically dead, mostly because of the internet. We're just pardon the phrase, we're fucked up as a culture. I don't know what's obscene anymore, right? I don't know what it is that would offend contemporary values anymore because we are so depraved as a society. Just Google anything and you'll see what I'm talking about. So I think that's just an exception. But I don't think constitutional standards should be varied by where you are. I don't think that's how law works. I don't know if anything you want to add to that. And I didn't mean to curse, but it gets your attention at 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
No, that's okay. I was just throwing that out, and I certainly don't think it's a general strategy for thinking about the Constitution. But it might be a way of dealing, perhaps, with issues where the intersection between our constitutional values and our local culture is so deep-seated, and the differences among local cultures are so profound. And no, I would not apply that to much of the rest of the Constitution. But I can understand, I mean, to be sure, the obscenity doctrine, from the time it was articulated, they didn't know about the internet, right? They were literally just watching movies on movie reviews. But it seems to me that the instinct there has something to be said for it, quite apart from the justices being sick and tired of watching movies.
And funny story, Justice Harlan, the second Justice Harlan was basically blind towards the end of his life, so he couldn't even see the damn things. He had to just listen.
No, except Justice Marshall always sat next to him and took tremendous pleasure
Of describing for him.
in describing graphically, out loud, what was going on.
Oh, God.
So even though Justice Harlan was blind, he could reach a considered judicial decision.
Considered, huh? Well, Yvette, that's a good note to leave you on. Thank you all. Go home and watch some Netflix or something. And have a good day. Thank you.